In the last video, we discovered that the number 40 has great significance for Lent. We fast for 40 days leading up to Easter. So let's look at the stories in the Bible, both the Old Testament and the New Testament, that have the number 40 to hopefully get a better understanding of the meaning of this number and why it's significant during Lent. So first, if we look at the Old Testament, here are some images that would help us remember the stories that have the number 40. The first story from the book of Genesis has the character Noah in it. And God decided that he wanted to punish the people for being disobedient. So he flooded the world, all except for Noah and the animals and his family, who were taken onto an ark and protected. And after 40 days of flooding, God stopped flooding the world and made a covenant with Noah that he would no longer flood the world, and that the people had learned their lesson from that time of trial. The second story that has 40 days is the 40 days that Moses spent on Mount Sinai with God. He went up to the mountain and spent there 40 days learning from God, listening to his ways and his laws, so that he could receive them and come back to the people with these laws. The next story, and this is a very significant 40-year period, is when the Israelites were wandering in the deserts. So the Israelites in the desert. And as the story goes, scouts went into the promised land, into Canaan, and they came back and told some misleading stories about the people and the threats that were in the promised land that caused the Israelites to start to doubt God and his plan. So they were grumbling, and they were questioning whether God would protect them as they went into this promised land. And because of that, God punished the people for 40 years to wander in the desert, to really rediscover the faith that they needed to have in him. Despite all of the things that he showed them, despite taking them out of Egypt and crossing through the Red Sea, they still doubted God. And because of that, they were punished for 40 years and really rediscovered their faith in God. The next story is from 1 Kings. And here Elijah was escaping the Israelites because he had been a prophet with great power, and he was escaping to Mount Horeb, and he was there guided by God for 40 days to Mount Horeb, and on Mount Horeb he was able to really see God or witness God in a very new way. He heard God in a whisper on the mountain. And finally, the last story, the 40-day period in which, this is from the book of Jonah. He was in the city of Nineveh. So Jonah was most known for being taken up into the belly of the whale and taken and spit out into Nineveh. He was questioning God's will and God's plan, and he had eventually been turned back to Nineveh. And once he was in Nineveh, the Ninevites were supposedly going to be destroyed after a 40-day period. And during that 40-day period, the people there decided to repent in fasting and wearing sackcloth. In the New Testament, we have two important stories. One of the most important, which is from the temptation of Jesus. After the baptism of Jesus, he went out into the desert led by the Spirit and fasted for 40 days until he was being tempted by the devil. And that story actually has a lot of connections to the Israelites being tempted or being wandering in the desert. And you can see that just because of the quotes in the story. The first temptation was met with the quote, "One does not live on bread alone, one follows God's plan." And the second, "Do not put God to the test," which the Israelites did. And the third, to worship God alone, which the Israelites often failed to do throughout the Old Testament. So those are the three answers to the tests of the devil. And that 40-day period was a time in which Jesus was prepared for that test. He was fasting and preparing for his ministry on earth, and he was reinvigorated by the 40 days in which he could prepare, living on faith in the Spirit. The next 40-day period is from the Ascension. So there, between the resurrection and the Ascension, there's 40 days, and then 10 days later, Pentecost. So that 40-day period is really just a significant number throughout